Yep, that's it. For those of you that don't know me, I have a very dark and twisted sense of humor, and I saw that video and I laughed for a full hour. I just thought it was the greatest thing. And it kind of ties into what we're going to be talking about today, the fact that we all have enemies, and that we need to decide as Christians how we're going to respond to those who don't respond to us the way that they should. I was teaching a Bible study, this was years ago, and I was going into the whole thing about enemies and how we should respond to them and how we should treat them. And one guy raised his hand and he said, "But as Christians, we're not supposed to have enemies." And I wanted to say, "Are you high?" I didn't, it was a Bible study. But remember that whole Jesus being crucified thing? That wasn't his book club. Those were enemies. And he had his enemies, and he talks very plainly about the fact that we have enemies as well, and that there is a way that we are to respond to them. Basically, people who do not respond to us the way that they should. And it's difficult. Make no bones about it. And what we're going to be talking to you about today is difficult, and that's putting it lightly. But it is something that we are asked to do. And so what we're going to be doing is just I like to walk through the passage first, and we'll be going through, again, another part of the Sermon on the Mount. This is in chapter 5, Matthew 5. And you can turn on your Bible or turn in your Bible to Matthew 5, verse 38. Matthew 5, verse 38. And we're just going to walk through this passage because this is one of those passages where there is a lot of misunderstandings about what is said here. The people of that day understood what he was saying, but that's a culture far removed from us, and so we need to sort of bring that to present day and talk about that a little bit. And then we'll talk about how we can take some of these things and apply them to our lives today, okay? So Matthew 5, verse 38. And he begins with, "You have heard the law that says," and again, Jesus is referring to the fact that they had the Old Testament, then they took the Old Testament and had written out interpretations of the Old Testament, then they had taken those interpretations and had interpretations of those interpretations, and they had really kind of skewed the meaning of Scripture and had misunderstood it in a huge way. In fact, some of the misconceptions that they had then, we still have today. And Jesus was saying, "You've heard this, but..." He says, you have heard that the law says, the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is one of the most misunderstood verses of Scripture. Absolutely, completely misunderstood. They misunderstood it then, and we very often misunderstand it now. And he's quoting from the Old Testament. It says several times in the Old Testament. In fact, it's very detailed. It says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, and a stripe for a stripe. That's pretty detailed. But what we don't understand is that what God was telling us is that that was a maximum, not a minimum. It was a maximum, meaning that's the farthest that you could go. You didn't start there. That wasn't the floor, that was the ceiling. And so the absolute worst that you could do was try to make justice or bring about a responsibility or a punishment that actually matched what happened to you, okay? So if either through intent or an accident, somebody accidentally took out your eye, you couldn't just go and grab your melon baller and then go chase the guy down and then yank out his, okay? That's not what's being said here. That was a graphic picture. I'm very sorry about that. So, we can't just go around, doling out justice on our own. There is a justice system in place, and the max that you could do is this, because when it comes to getting back at people, when it comes to revenge, what do we want to do? Just a little bit more than they did to us. Am I right? Or maybe a lot extra more. And if you don't believe me, just look at our legal system. Somebody gets upset over the simplest thing, and they're suing a company for $10 million. I don't know if there's any injustice that's worth, I'm not even going to get into that. But it's crazy. We just go overboard. And Jesus is saying, this is the maximum that you can do, okay? So he goes on to say that not only is that not a requirement, but in verse 39, but I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. This is another one that we get a little bit wrong. There was a way of insulting people in Jesus' day where you took the back of your hand and you lightly slapped the person, almost a touch, with the back of their hand to their cheek. It was basically today's equivalent of the middle finger, okay? And that was a way of insulting somebody. You would just go up to them and you just like, yeah, just kind of like that sister's doing to her brother right now. You just walk up to them and you do the nip and you just kind of do this. And Jesus is saying, don't take that bait. Don't give in to that. Turn your other cheek to them. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you really that upset? You want to do it on this side too? Will that make you feel better? Don't take that bait. And he's saying, don't give in to that. Verse 40, he goes on to say, if you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. So Roman soldiers had basically, or Rome, had taken over this area, Israel, and they were under their authority. And a Roman soldier could go up to any person at any time, any civilian, and point them out and have them carry their gear, it doesn't matter what you're doing, carry their gear for them. And Roman law said that the maximum that you could carry it, or that you would have to carry it, would be 1 mile. But Jesus is saying, don't just drop it after a mile, carry it for them 2 miles. Carry it for them too. He goes on to say, give to those who ask and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So this is another one. There was something during their time, and this was under the Israelite law, that every 7th year would be called a year of Jubilee. Some of you may have heard of this. It was a year of Jubilee. And during the year of Jubilee, all debts were canceled, all slaves were freed. All debts canceled, all slaves freed. So even if you were working out a debt, I can't pay the debt, so I'm going to indenture myself to you for a certain amount of time until that debt is paid back, and then you were let go, and that was it. But if you, during the year of Jubilee, you're still enslaved, and then it would just be over with. And though this is a great deal, right? If you're the person borrowing the money. And so what would happen is somebody would come to somebody and they would ask for money, but guess what? The year of Jubilee is in 2 months. So that's not a great deal for the lender, is it? And so Jesus is saying, but don't turn that person away. If they are in need, if that person really is in need, give to them what they need. Don't just think about yourself. Okay? Continuing on, verse 43. You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemies. This is the most radical, maybe the most insane thing Jesus says. It's absolutely just off the charts crazy. I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. So Jesus is saying that just like he loves all people, you need to do the same thing as well. Keep in mind, this is an agrarian society, a farming society. Both rain and sunshine were good things. Both were necessary. And Jesus was saying, just as my Father provides both of those things for all people, he doesn't just have rain just fall on top of the good people. It's everywhere because he loves everyone, and there's a sense of equity in the way that he deals with people, and you need to have that same equity. You need to have that same mindset. And when you do that, you are being like your Father in heaven, because all of the things that God calls us to do are extensions of who he is. They come out of his nature. He didn't just come up with a list of rules. He didn't just pick them out of the air. These are things that embody who he is. God tells us to love others because God is love. He tells us to tell the truth because God is truth. And so these are extensions of who he is. And so just as God treats all of us the same way, we are to treat everyone else the same way. Then he wraps it up with this. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Very often we read that last part. That's kind of a summary statement. We read that last little bit and we're like, whatever. I don't know how. Perfect? Yeah, I'm a long ways from that. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with that verse. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But God calls us to pursue that perfection and to pursue living in a certain way that has a certain mindset. He calls us to live in a way that says, don't always demand your rights. Don't always demand justice. But instead, be willing to offer grace. Be willing to offer grace. And he knows what he's calling us to do is not easy. It is not easy. And yet it is something that we're supposed to pursue anyway. And we'll find as we take a look at this that we benefit almost more by showing grace than the other person that we're showing grace to. But what I want to do is just talk about some of the things that we can pull from this. And the first thing that we see is this. Jesus is telling us to take little and give much. Take little and give much. And this is very difficult in a society, an American society that says, look out for number one, take care of yourself, first thing about you and yours, and there's 100 other catchphrases that embody the same idea. But that's not what Jesus says. We are to take little and to give much and be conscious of what is going on with others and be willing to help them out. You know, there was a time where I was at Food Lion, and we had seen the man out in the parking lot, and he was looking for some handouts. And me and my daughters, we went to the store and got our things. And as we head to the front of the store, we see him. He has a jar of change, huge jar of change. And he's at the change counter, the little machine, and he's pouring it into the thing. I mean, it's taking him 20 minutes just to count the change. And he's putting it in there. And I said, after we left the store and we got into the car, I go, see, girls, there are times where people, they say they don't have anything, but they're asking for things anyway. And I guarantee you he's getting that much on a regular basis. And so sometimes our charity does more to hurt than to help. And we need to show a little bit of wisdom in that. And my daughter Claire, as she is apt to do, freaks out. Just comes completely unhinged. But Dad, how do you know? They just do this. My house is full of drama. I can't help it. I've got two daughters, and I've got my wife Angie. I have a dog and a cat, and they're both female. It's awesome. It's exactly the life I envisioned as a little boy. So she's losing her mind. Dad, how can we know? How can we know? How can we know who to help and who not to help? And I said, well, you can't always know. You can't always know. But I would rather make the mistake of helping someone who didn't need it than not help someone who did. And that's a little bit of the mindset that he's talking about here. We lean towards the risk, not stinginess. We lean towards giving, not keeping. We still have wisdom. We still think things through. And here he talks about a court case. And, you know, he's not saying that if somebody sues you for $1 million, we'll just give them $2 million. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that we need to have a mindset in all of these various situations that leans towards love, leans towards grace, and even towards risk and giving, even when there might not be anything reciprocated for that. And he talks about all these situations. He gives all of his trivial situations like when somebody insults you to a serious situation like is being taken to court, whether it's somebody who's your equal or somebody who's over authority you, like a Roman soldier. It doesn't matter the situation. We need to always have a mindset of giving, of grace, of love, of leaning towards the benefit of the other. And yeah, that's a difficult thing to do. It's about denying your rights in a world and a culture that is constantly screaming for their rights. And when you do this, folks, when you do this, you get people's attention. You get people's attention in a huge way. Because in a world where people are constantly talking about their own rights, when we start saying, yes, but what about the rights of the other person? It really calls attention to the fact that we are to be Christians who are set apart, who are governed by an attitude of grace. We're governed by an attitude of grace. We are to take little and give much. The other thing that we can pull from this is that we need to be praying. Jesus says, not only love your enemies, but pray for them. To pray for your enemies. Again, another radical concept. And this is, in fact, has a little bit to do with just the idea of forgiveness, of forgiving that other person. It's happens all the time. Pastor Steve or I will talk about this very subject, and we talk about how there, that forgiveness is something that we need to be doing as a lifestyle. And just sort of go off on this a little bit. It's a lifestyle. Forgiveness is a lifestyle. It isn't something that you dole out in units, okay? So you don't say, well, I'm going to forgive this person because what they did, it really wasn't that serious. And I'm going to forgive this person, I guess, even though it was more serious, but they said they were sorry, so I'll forgive them. And then this person, I'm not going to forgive them. They haven't even asked for forgiveness. It's way too much. It's not something that you dole out in units. It's a lifestyle. And it's universal. Just as God has forgiven all of us. We don't forgive on a scale. We forgive, period. And what we're not talking about is trust. We are required to forgive. We're not required to trust. I just talked to, and these are harsh words, but these are consequences. These are trust issues. I was just talking to a lady not too long ago, and she allowed this guy let him borrow her credit card. And he bought the things that he was supposed to, and then a whole bunch of stuff that he wasn't supposed to. She goes, what do I do? And I said, call the police. There are consequences to our actions. Oh, and don't let him use your credit card again. Forgive him for what he did. Don't give him your credit card. Do you see the difference? Forgiveness, trust. Okay? So there is a difference. Having said all that, there's still, every now and again, Pastor Steve or I will talk on this subject in a sermon or what have you, and we'll sort of wait around after the service, and somebody will come up to us and they'll say, yes, I know that we're supposed to forgive everyone, but you don't know what this person did. You don't know what I'm going through. And folks, let me tell you right now, every single one of you in this room, you're thinking about a thing or a person or a circumstance or an issue where you're just like, you're just grinding your teeth over it. You're smiling at me, but you're just and it's eating at you. And I understand that. I do. I get that. We have been legitimately hurt. But we're only going to hurt ourselves more if we hold on to it. And praying for that person is part of the process of forgiveness, of letting it go. And we tell that person, I hate to break this to you, but this person, they're living their own life. They've already forgotten about this, and they've let it go. You probably need to do the same. And as you pray for that person, it helps with the process of forgiveness. We all have legitimate hurts, and I would love to tell you that there's just this little switch somewhere on you, and you just flip it, and all of a sudden, you don't think about that grievance anymore. But it doesn't work that way. It's a process. It's a process, and it's something that you work on over time, and prayer helps you with that process. And the prayer goes a little something like this. Lord, I just pray your best for that person. I pray your best for that person. And you put that person in God's hands. You put that person in God's way of teaching lessons. You put that person in God's hands of showing the right way. And who knows? That relationship even may come to a point where it's mended. But you give them over to God. And you learn to just let that go. And you'll be doing more for yourself than you will be for the other person in a lot of respects. Is it easy? No. Is it a process? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. But you will be doing yourself such a favor. And Jesus knew this by giving it over to God. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences. It doesn't mean that there's no room for justice. Yes, there is. It doesn't. Talking about a different, yet people need to be, people need to be held accountable for their actions. But what we're talking about is, when it comes to you, is letting that go. After it's been dealt with in the way that it best can be, letting it go. All right. Then the third thing we see is this. We are to pursue maturity. We are to pursue maturity. Our morals do not hinge on the morals of others. Our morals don't hinge on the morals of others. In other words, if they do something horrible, we don't get to do something horrible in return. Okay? Just because everyone around us is doing something a certain way doesn't mean that we get to do it that way too. We are to pursue maturity. And here is one of the harder truths of growing spiritually. When it comes to two people having a conflict, the more spiritually mature of the two will have to make the greater sacrifice. Not always, but often. The more spiritually mature of the two people in conflict will very often have to make the greater sacrifice. There's on some level, some right that they forego in order to mend that relationship if possible, or to at least do what God has put on their hearts to be responsible for. And at the end, in verse 48, that verse that we'd like to skip over, it says, "But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." And we read that and we're like, well, that's impossible, so what do I do with this? What do I do with this verse? And what's being talked about here, that word perfect is a very specific word. It means that something is functioning the way that it should. Okay? It's doing its intended job. Right now, this table is perfect. These things aren't hitting the floor. See how that works? That's great. So it is perfect. It's doing what it was designed to do, and is doing it exactly the way that it should. And what Jesus is saying is that you have been called to be set apart. You have been called to be mature. You are to grow in that maturity, and you are being perfected in that. And as you pursue the guidelines that God set down, you will grow in that perfection, and you will come to that full maturity. And it's something that we work on little by very, very little. Okay? Little bit by very little bit. There's a great quote here by Amy Carmichael. It says, "Sometimes when we read the words of those who have been more than conquerors," talking about our spiritual heroes, "been more than conquerors, we feel almost despondent. I feel that I shall never be like that. but they won through step by little bits of will, little denials of self, little inward victories by faithfulness in very little things. They became what they are. They became what they are. No one sees these little hidden steps. They only see the accomplishment. But even so, those small steps were taken. There is no sudden triumph of spiritual maturity. That is the work of the moment. We grow spiritually as we choose to do so on a week by week, day by day, hour by hour basis. As we come across situations where we see that we need to be responding in a certain way, and the spiritually mature are able to connect the dots between what is going on in front of them and how that ties to their responsibility. They're able to see what's going on in front of them and how their responses will have an effect on everyone around them and everything that is going on around them, both at that point and in the future. And they realize that they have to be very careful, and that if they're going to be a Christian, if they're going to set themselves apart, if they're going to live the way Christ told them to, they have to see those dots. They have to connect them, and they have to respond accordingly. You know, Philippians 1:6 says, "And I am certain that God who began the good work in you will continue his work until his finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns." Our saving grace in all of this, realizing that we are by no means perfect, is the fact that we have someone that we can count on who is. And Jesus Christ, he knew that what he was telling people at this time was insanely difficult. It was radical. Love your enemies. You can't be serious. But he not only knew that this was the way to live, but he also demonstrated it. Even to the point of praying for those who crucified him on a cross. Now, as we take a look at these things and we see that phrase, be perfect as God is perfect, you know, is that another switch that we can flip? No. It is something that we work on little by very, very little. But we are not alone in that. And one of the things that we must realize is that God is with us and helping us to see those things. If we rely on him and go to him, then he will very often help us through those situations. I can't stress enough the idea of process. It is something that takes time. And I can't remember who said this, but I'm just going to put it in my own words. I have had no greater irritation and struggle with any other person more than Barry Jones. We get so frustrated with ourselves. We want to see ourselves grow. We take a step forward, and then we take 3 steps back. But folks, that's how it works. And we must strive. We must strive to do better. You know, one of the things that really stands out to me when it comes to this idea of leaning towards grace, leaning towards love, leaning towards the benefit of the other. It's the whole idea of churches that like to protest. I've never really seen any good come out of that. I'll never forget, I was talking to a young man, this was about a month or so ago, and he had gone to a Comic-Con. For those of you that are not nerds, let me explain what a Comic-Con is. A Comic-Con is a place where a bunch of nerds and geeks of various design get together and they talk about comic books and collectible card games and superhero movies and video games, and it's awesome. It's great. It's the bestest. And so he went to this Comic-Con, and it was just a local one, And there was a church outside picketing, protesting, whatever, the Comic-Con. Go figure. I don't really know what they were doing that was so evil, but they were protesting it. And my friend, a young friend, went to the guy and tried to have a dialogue, tried to talk with the person, find out, okay, so what is it that we're doing? That's, I go to church. What is it that's so awful that we're doing? And they wouldn't really talk to him. They were too busy screaming out of megaphones and all that kind of good stuff. And he came to me the Sunday afterwards, and he said, why are they doing this? And I said, well, there's a reason why they're doing this. They're morons. They're slack-jawed idiots. That's the reason. And, I talked to him about it a little bit, and there's something about a church that decides, we're going to take our feelings and put them on cardboard, and we're going to run out there, that says, we're going to go get them. There's something about a church that protests that says, we're going to teach them a lesson. It doesn't work, but that's the mindset. There's a revenge mentality there, as opposed to a grace mentality. Do you see Jesus picketing anyone? Or, do you see him teaching his disciples to do the same? No. There are times to demonstrate. There are times but I think I'm just talking about churches and how very often they just flat out get it wrong. And Jesus sat down with people and had a dialogue with people. Did you know that in his society, in Jesus' society, when you sat down and you had a meal with another person, you're sitting across the table from another person and you're having a meal together, basically that was a way of saying, I have nothing against this person. I forgive this person. We have a relationship. And it drove the Pharisees insane. It drove them nuts because he sat down with the dregs of humanity and ate meals with them. And they went around and said, I can't, there's this guy, Jesus, and he says he's from God and he's performing miracles, but he's having meals with tax collectors and prostitutes. And Jesus was like, yeah, he wore it as a badge of pride. He was like, absolutely, that's what I'm doing. It's called grace. It's called love. It's called reaching out. We need to be like Jesus in this respect. We need to realize that there's always going to be somebody out there that doesn't like us for some reason or another. And that we must still err on the side of grace, err on the side of love, err on the side of the benefit of the other. And my challenge to you today is this. What is an area? Where's that very little bit that you can be moving in a positive direction? It may be letting go of a past hurt. It may be beginning to pray for a certain somebody. It may be just an attitude change when it comes to helping others. It may be an area where you've been holding on to something and you know it's holding back on your maturity. But prayerfully consider, what is a direction that God may want me to go in? And let me tell you, I'm preaching this to me just as much as everybody else. Do not mistake my words for perfection. We're all in this climb together. And we need to be asking ourselves, Lord, what is it that you want me to do? How do you want me to change? I'm going to go ahead and ask the worship team to come on back up on stage. And as they do that, please keep in mind that we have our giving stations. I'm reverting back to the announcer guy. We have our communion stations. We have one in the back and one right up here. If you'd like to take part in communion, please feel free to do so. We also have the cross over here. This is kind of a place for you to pray. if you want to begin that prayer right now. We also have several people that are on standby. If you would like someone to pray with you, they're more than willing to do that. Just ask. We also have our blue bag. The blue bag is basically if you haven't accepted Jesus as your forgiver and your leader, and you're ready to do that. It's something that you've been putting off, and you're ready to do that today. You can come up to the stage or in the back and pick one of these up. And somebody will come alongside you and unpack this with you. It'll take about 7 or 8 minutes, and they will explain to you in very simple terms what it means to accept Christ as your forgiver and your leader, as a follower of Christ. But begin asking yourself, how can I err? How can I lean in the direction of love and grace and the benefit of others, regardless of what our history may be? And allow God to simply speak to you. I would love, we talked about those past hurts and those past grievances and issues. I would love to just put up some bullet points on the screen that just says, just do these things and you'll be fine. But we have way too many different kinds of circumstances out there. Circumstances that truly only God understands. Please go to Him in prayer. Please surrender these things to Him and allow Him to show you how you can heal from this and move from this and benefit from it.